Hello again, everybody, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Liberty Watch, where we look at the world through a libertarian lens. Today will be a special book review episode. We'll be reviewing the book by Murray Rothbard entitled Anatomy of the State. And as you'll recall, in the Declaration of Independence, there's a line in there that says something like, "Governments were instituted among men to protect our natural rights such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Well, as it turns out, that was kind of wishful thinking by the Founding Fathers, because as we'll see in this book, governments were created for quite another reason. So let's get started.
The state is almost universally considered an institution of social service. Some theorists venerate the state as the apotheosis of society. Others regard it as an amiable, though often inefficient, organization for achieving social ends. But almost all regard it as a necessary means for achieving the goals of mankind, a means to be ranged against the private sector and often winning in this competition of resources. With the rise of democracy, the identification of the state with society has been redoubled until it is common to hear sentiments expressed which violate virtually every tenet of reason and common sense, such as, "We are the government." The useful collective term "we" has enabled an ideological camouflage to be thrown over the reality of political life. If we are the government, then anything a government does to an individual is not only just and untyrannical, but also voluntary on the part of the individual concerned. Under this reasoning, any Jews murdered by the Nazi government were not murdered. Instead, they must have committed suicide, since they were the government, which was democratically chosen, and therefore anything the government did to them was voluntary on their part. One would not think it necessary to belabor this point, and yet the overwhelming bulk of the people hold this fallacy to a greater or lesser degree. We must therefore emphasize that we are not the government. The government is not us.
How many times have you heard a politician say, "We did this," or "We did that"? If we take us to mean the government, then you could say we have stationed troops in over 140 countries around the world. We've dropped bombs in over 20 countries since World War II. We support brutal dictators as long as they do what we say. How about we kill thousands of people in other countries every year? How about we overthrow democratically elected governments in other countries? We also could say, if us is the government, that we engage in torture, that we have incarcerated ourselves more than any other country on earth, thrown ourselves in jail. And the list of "we" goes on and on. Did we do all these things? No. So don't confuse "we" or "us" with the government.
If then the state is not us, if it is not the human family getting together to decide mutual problems, if it is not a lodge meeting or country club, what is it? Briefly, the state is that organization in society which attempts to maintain a monopoly of the use of force and violence in a given territorial area. In particular, it is the only organization in society that obtains its revenue not by voluntary contribution or payment for services rendered, but by coercion. While other individuals or institutions obtain their income by production of goods and services, and by the peaceful and voluntary sale of these goods and services to others, the state obtains its revenue by the use of compulsion, that is, by the use and the threat of the jailhouse and the bayonet.
Hey, you know, you got nice business. You got a nice wife. Look at the beautiful children, little Johnny, little Susie. You know, I hate to see something bad happen to them. So I'm just offering you a little protection here, that's all.
Man is born naked into the world and needing to use his mind to learn how to take the resources given him by nature and to transform them, for example, by investment in capital, into shapes and forms and places where the resources can be used for the satisfaction of his wants and the advancement of his standard of living. Man has found that through the process of voluntary mutual exchange, the productivity and hence the living standards of all participants in exchange may increase enormously. The only natural course for man to survive and to attain wealth, therefore, is by using his mind and energy to engage in the production and exchange process. He does this first by finding natural resources and then by transforming them, by mixing his labor with them, as Locke puts it, to make them his individual property, and then by exchanging this property for the similarly obtained property of others. The social path dictated by the requirements of man's nature, therefore, is the path of property rights and the free market of gift or exchange of such rights. The great German sociologist Franz Oppenheimer pointed out that there are two mutually exclusive ways of acquiring wealth. One, the above way of production and exchange, he called the economic means. The other way is simpler in that it does not require productivity. It is the way of seizure of another's goods or services by the use of force and violence. This is the method of one-sided confiscation, of theft of the property of others. This is the method which Oppenheimer termed the political means to wealth.
So as we can see, the state gains its resources by extracting it from those who have earned it. It does this in a number of different ways. There are property taxes, income taxes, tariffs, hunting licenses, building permits, marriage licenses. The list goes on and on and on. What do all these do? Is it to protect us? No, it's to extract resources from us.
We are now in a position to answer more fully the question, what is the state? The state, in the words of Oppenheimer, is the organization of the political means. It is the systematization of the predatory process over a given territory. The state provides a legal, orderly, systematic channel for the predation of private property. It renders certain, secure, and relatively peaceful the lifeline of the parasitic caste in society. Since production must always precede predation, the free market is anterior to the state. The state has never been created by a social contract. It has always been born in conquest and exploitation. Once a state has been established, the problem of the ruling group or caste is how to maintain their rule. While force is their modus operandi, their basic and long-run problem is ideological. For in order to continue in office, any group, not simply a democratic government, must have the support of the majority of its subjects. This support, it must be noted, need not be active enthusiasm. It may well be passive resignation as if to an inevitable law of nature. The majority must be persuaded by ideology that their government is good, wise, and at least inevitable, and certainly better than other conceivable alternatives. Promoting this ideology among the people is the vital social task of the intellectuals. The intellectuals are, therefore, the opinion molders in society. and since it is precisely a molding of opinion that the state most desperately needs, the basis for an age-old alliance between the state and the intellectuals becomes clear. The state is willing to offer the intellectuals a secure and permanent berth in the state apparatus, and thus a secure income and the panoply of prestige. For the intellectuals will be handsomely rewarded for the important function they perform for the state rulers, of which group they now become a part.
In these passages, Rothbard underlines the long-standing and cozy relationship between the intellectuals and the state. In times past, those intellectuals might be spiritual leaders, for example, priests. Hey, the Pharaoh might say, look, you guys, you priests now, you just make sure that the people understand that I am one with the sun god, so they should worship me. They should be in awe of me, okay? You keep them in line. You help keep them in line for me. And what I'll give you in return is I'll let you keep some of the offerings they give to you, okay? There's going to be something in this for you too. So we'll just have this cozy little relationship. In more modern times, this has become more secular. Those elites that prop up the government are more likely to come from academia, okay, college professors. You see all these talking heads on television, and they may be talking about, well, let's just say they're talking about our war on terrorism. It's 2017 now, so we started this war in what, about 2002? It's been going on for a decade and a half now. How many times do you hear the hard questions asked by these reporters, like, how is this war going to go on forever? What's the end point? What's our overall strategy? No. You don't hear them a lot of times. They just want to say, oh, we should pursue this policy or that policy. And these talking heads, you know, they'll be for one policy for the Democrats or maybe a different policy for the Republicans. But they're always in favor of some policy, right? And what is that? Policy is just imposing state power on the rest of us. So there's just always, and another thing, the news media, let's say the airwaves media, the television, they're not going to say very much against the state. They're not going to ask real hard questions because, hey, have you heard of the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC? Well, if one of these television stations gets a little bit out of line, guess who can pull their license? It ain't me and you, folks. It's the FCC. So you've always had this cozy relationship between the intellectuals and they help prop up the state.
Many and varied have been the arguments by which the state and its intellectuals have induced their subjects to support their rule. The union of church and state was one of the oldest and most successful of these ideological devices. The ruler was either anointed by God or, in the case of the absolute rule of many Oriental despotisms, was himself God. Hence, any resistance to his rule would be blasphemy. The state's priestcraft performed the basic intellectual function of obtaining popular support and even worship for the rulers. Another successful device was to instill fear of any alternative systems of rule or non-rule. The present rulers, it was maintained, supplied to the citizens an essential service for which they should be most grateful, protection against sporadic criminals and marauders. Especially has the state been successful in recent centuries in instilling fear of other state rulers. Since most men tend to love their homeland, the identification of that land and its people with the state was a means of making natural patriotism work to the state's advantage. This device of nationalism has only been successful in Western civilization in recent centuries. It was not too long ago that the mass of subjects regarded wars as irrelevant battles between various sets of nobles. Many and subtle are the ideological weapons that the state has wielded through the centuries. One excellent weapon has been tradition. Worship of one's ancestors, then, becomes a none too subtle means of worship of one's ancient rulers. Another potent ideological force is to deprecate the individual and exalt the collectivity of society. For since any given rule implies majority acceptance, any ideological danger to that rule can only start from one or few independently thinking individuals. The new idea, much less the new critical idea, must needs begin as a small minority opinion. Therefore, the state must nip the view in the bud by ridiculing any view that defies the opinions of the mass. It is also important for the state to make its rule seem inevitable. Even if its reign is disliked, it will then be met with passive resignation, as witness the familiar coupling of death and taxes. Another tried and true method for bending subjects to the state's will is inducing guilt. Any increase in private well-being can be attacked as unconscionable greed, materialism, or excessive affluence. Profit-making can be attacked as exploitation and usury, mutually beneficial exchanges denounced as selfishness, and somehow with the conclusion always being drawn that more resources should be siphoned from the private to the public sector.
How many times have you heard this same lame argument that if you're not in favor of some government program that you're selfish or greedy? If you're not for government-run health care, you want people to die in the streets. If you're not for government-run welfare, you just don't care about the poor. You're just greedy. Please, give me a break. It's time that we started taking the moral high ground on this. And as a libertarian, I can tell you, if you steal money from your neighbor to make him give to some government program that you believe in at the point of a gun, folks, that's just robbery. There's nothing moral about that. We need to make that clear. We need to put these people on the defensive. They are the ones that are immoral, not us.
In the present more secular age, the divine right of the state has been supplemented by the invocation of a new God, science. State rule is now proclaimed as being ultra-scientific, as constituting planning by experts. The unremitting determination of its assaults on common sense is no accident, for as Mencken vividly maintained, the average man, whatever his errors otherwise, at least sees clearly that government is something outside the generality of his fellow men, that it is a separate, independent, and hostile power, only partly under his control and capable of doing him great harm. When a private citizen is robbed, a worthy man is deprived of the fruits of his industry and thrift. When the government is robbed, the worst that happens is that certain rogues and loafers have less money to play with than they had before. The notion that they have earned that money is never entertained. To most sensible men, it would seem ludicrous. Through the centuries, men have formed concepts designed to check and limit the exercise of state rule, and, one after another, the state, using its intellectual allies, has been able to transform these concepts into intellectual rubber stamps of legitimacy and virtue to attach to its decrees and actions. Originally, in Western Europe, the concept of divine sovereignty held that the kings may rule only according to divine law. The kings turned the concept into a rubber stamp of divine approval for any of the king's actions. The concept of the parliamentary democracy began as a popular check upon absolute monarchical rule. It ended with Parliament being the essential part of the state and its every act totally sovereign. Certainly the most ambitious attempt to impose limits on the state has been the Bill of Rights and other restrictive parts of the American Constitution, in which written limits on government became the fundamental law to be interpreted by a judiciary supposedly independent of the other branches of government. All Americans are familiar with the process by which the construction of limits in the Constitution has been inexorably broadened over the last century. But few have been as keen as Professor Charles Black to see that the state has, in the process, largely transformed judicial review itself from a limiting device to yet another instrument for furnishing ideological legitimacy to the government's actions. For while the seeming independence of the federal judiciary has played a vital part in making its actions virtual holy writ for the bulk of the people, it is also and ever true that the judiciary is part and parcel of the government apparatus and appointed by the executive and legislative branches. The state has set itself up as a judge in its own cause, thus violating a basic juridical principle for aiming at just decisions.
Now let's think for a moment what the Supreme Court is being asked to do in a lot of these cases. And a lot of these Supreme Court cases are just cases between the state government and the central government. And through the years, this balance of power has gone more and more toward the central government. It's assumed more and more power and allowed the states less and less power. Well, this makes sense if you think about it. After all, the Supreme Court is a part of the federal government. So allowing them to rule in these cases would be like someone being accused of a crime and allowing them to be the judge in the case. That's basically what you've got here, so it's no surprise it's moving in the federal direction. How could you expect to get an impartial ruling? Let's just look at an example, a recent example. You had this referendum in California on medical marijuana, and it passed. So medical marijuana was legal. And so you had this case, this lady named Angel Reich, that's R-A-I-C-H. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, but I'm going to pronounce it Reich. Ms. Reich was, for medicinal purposes, was growing some marijuana in her yard, and the federal government went after her even though it was legal in the state of California. So what did the Supreme Court rule in 2005, the case Gonzalez versus Reich? Well, not surprisingly, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government had the authority under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution to criminalize the production and use of cannabis, even in states where it's been legalized. Now, that flies totally in the face of the spirit of the 10th Amendment. What does the 10th Amendment say? It says that those powers not specifically enumerated in the federal Constitution should be reserved to the states and the people. This is a clear-cut example. Do you see anything in the Constitution that says, of course, you know, they created it out of thin air here. They read just about anything they want to, the Supreme Court does, into this Commerce Clause. This is just another case where they use that vague term, some of the vague language in the Constitution to justify just about anything they want to do. But clearly, there's nothing I see reading through the Constitution that says that the federal government should regulate what people can grow in their yard. And yet they've taken it on themselves to do so. So basically, you have the Supreme Court, because it's a part of the federal government, more often than not, rules in favor of the federal government. No surprise.
The standard version of the story of the New Deal and the court, though accurate in its way, displaces the emphasis. It concentrates on the difficulties. It almost forgets how the whole thing turned out. The upshot of the matter was, and this is what I like to emphasize, that after some 24 months of balking, the Supreme Court, without a single change in the law of its composition or indeed in its actual manning, placed the affirmative stamp of legitimacy on the New Deal and on the whole new conception of government in America.
Let me add a little background to Rothbard's New Deal comments. Some of the New Deal legislation that Franklin Roosevelt wanted to get passed, he actually got it passed through the legislature and he signed it. But the Supreme Court ruled that they were unconstitutional, that they simply didn't have the authority to pass some of these laws they were trying to pass. Well, not to be thwarted, FDR said, okay, you guys on the court, if you want to play hardball and not go along with my program, I can play hardball too. I've got a willing legislature there, and I will sign it into law. So what we'll do is we'll just create more seats on the Supreme Court. All right? We'll pass the legislation. I'll get to pick the new Supreme Court members, and then I'll have a majority of people that agree with me on the Supreme Court. This was called packing the court. He was trying to pack the court. Well, the people on the Supreme Court knew that, by golly, he could probably get this done. So instead of standing up to him, they backed down, and that's how a lot of this New Deal legislation got through. It was really unconstitutional. And so this was one of the periods where the size and scope of the federal government just mushroomed.
Thus, the state has invariably shown a striking talent for the expansion of its powers beyond any limits that might be imposed upon it. Since the state necessarily lives by the compulsory confiscation of private capital, and since its expansion necessarily involves ever greater incursions on private individuals and private enterprise, we must assert that the state is profoundly and inherently anti-capitalist. Instead, the state, the organization of the political means, constitutes and is the source of the ruling class, and is in permanent opposition to genuinely private capital. The death of a state can come about in two major ways: through conquest by another state, or through revolutionary overthrow by its own subjects. In short, by war or revolution. War and revolution, as the two basic threats, invariably arouse in the state rulers their maximum efforts and maximum propaganda among the people. In war, state power is pushed to its ultimate, and under the slogans of defense and emergency, it can impose a tyranny upon the public such as might be openly resisted in times of peace. War thus provides many benefits to a state, and indeed every modern war has brought to the warring peoples a permanent legacy of increased state burdens upon society. War, moreover, provides to a state tempting opportunities for conquest of land areas over which it may exercise its monopoly of force. We may test the hypothesis that the state is largely interested in protecting itself rather than its subjects by asking, which category of crimes does the state pursue and punish most intensely, those against private citizens or those against itself? The gravest crimes in the state's lexicon are almost invariably not invasions of private person or property, but dangers to its own contentment.
What crimes are most egregious to the state? Property crimes? Mass murder? Rape? No. The three crimes mentioned in the Constitution are treason, piracy, and counterfeiting. And you can see where counterfeiting, the state wouldn't like that, because if you print some fake money, it makes their money less valuable. And treason, that's a crime against the state, obviously. And the other one mentioned there, by the way, is piracy. And in the 18th century, actually, state-sponsored piracy was pretty common.
Just as the two basic and mutually exclusive interrelations between men are peaceful cooperation or coercive exploitation, production or predation, so the history of mankind, particularly its economic history, may be considered as a contrast between these two principles. On the one hand, there is creative productivity, peaceful exchange and cooperation. On the other, coercive dictation and predation over those social relations. While social power is over nature, state power is power over man. Through history, man's productive and creative forces have, time and again, carved out new ways of transforming nature for man's benefit. These have been the times when social power has spurted ahead of state power, and when the degree of state encroachment over society has considerably lessened. But always, after a greater or smaller time lag, the state has moved into these new areas to cripple and confiscate social power once more. Of all the numerous forms that governments have taken over the centuries, of all the concepts and institutions that have been tried, none has succeeded in keeping the state in check.
This is an important point here. There are several different strategies that have been used throughout time to try to limit the scope of the government. It doesn't matter whether it's a monarchy, a dictatorship, a democratic republic. It always grows larger with time. The budget always needs to go up and up and up a little bit more each year. I mean, look at the United States government with its written constitution. The Constitution was supposed to limit the size and scope of government. Yet what do we have now? What started as the smallest government in history is now the largest government in human history, with a national debt of nearly $20 trillion and growing. In earlier centuries, the masses used to think of wars as being just between nobles and kings, and not a lot of their business. In modern times, however, more people have become to adopt those wars as their own. A sense of nationalism has caused this, and this has in part been inculcated in us through the use of state-run schools. Just think what we learned in school. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Or, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Okay, we've kind of adopted the state. The divine was once used to endorse the state rulers, such as the divine right of kings. More recently, the old gods have been replaced by a new god, science. We're told through these bureaucrats how our state planning is done using ultra-scientific methods. We've also learned today that any attempts to impose limits on the state, no matter what the form of the state is, a democracy, a democratic republic, or a monarchy, these restrictions have always failed. The state tends to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So the reason I wanted to introduce you guys to this book is because you have this struggle between state power and individual power. And as a libertarian, I believe people should be given their individual rights, their natural rights. We don't get our rights from the state. We believe in natural rights. They come from God. And the more power you give to the state, the less liberty, the less freedom you're going to have for yourself. I'm Liberty Man Van, and that's our show for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, tell somebody. Help us spread the word. We have a blog now. It's libertymanvan.com, and you can go there and read the text to the videos, or within that text you'll find a link to get to the videos. Join us again next time to discuss some libertarian principles where we don't believe you need some guy with a bullhorn to tell you what to do.